Yeah. Well, one possibility is to contest the translation, as it shows there. Another translation possibility is of the great God and of our Savior, or the Savior of us. So you can contest the translation of these texts. What's interesting is that the Rekovian Catechism discusses these texts, and it suggests that this particular pattern, right? So the argument is put forth, okay, when you have an article, a noun, a conjunction, and then another noun, or adjectives or whatever, those nouns go together. There's a single thing being referred to there. And the Rekovian Catechism gives counterexamples to that. And it says, no, that pattern does not always hold in the New Testament. Sometimes you have an article, a noun, a conjunction, and then the next noun refers to something else. So that's one way. There's a whole debate about this. It's called the Granville Sharp Rule, and it's very controversial. One of the interesting things about this rule is that this rule seems to only have validity in these particular cases. So it's uncontroversial that there are counterexample cases where, maybe one of the nouns is plural or one of the nouns is whatever. It seems to only ever apply in these particular cases where, the interpretation of the text is precisely what's at dispute. I don't know exactly what to say about that. It seems to me that even if you grant that Christ here is being called God, it doesn't follow that he's being called God in the sense that applies to the Father, because in ancient times it was appropriate, perfectly normal to call human beings gods or angels or whatever. Personally, my opinion is that Christ is called God only after his resurrection and only with respect to his exalted state after his resurrection and his ascension into heaven. So then, after he has been resurrected from the dead and made immortal and exalted to the right hand of God, he can be called God with a lowercase g, you might say. And he's a God, just like the later Christian tradition would talk about deification. So you have this idea in Irenaeus and in other figures that human beings, the goal of humanity is for God to deify them and to create gods out of human beings. Obviously, gods by grace and not by nature. I think that that's probably something going on like this here. It seems to me that it would be natural to think of the resurrected and exalted Christ as a deified human being. And in that sense, he can be called God, just as in later Catholic tradition, human beings are said to be made God through the process of deification. So I think probably something like that is also going on here.
Hebrews 1:8, I was going to bring up Hebrews 1:8, Romans 9:5. So I guess you would apply the same principles there.
Yeah, I think the same argument goes here. Either you can test the translation. For Hebrews 1:8, for example, this text is notoriously ambiguous. It could be translated, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever, or you could say, God is thy throne forever and ever, because, again, the grammatical structure of the Greek and the original Hebrew sentence permits both interpretations. With respect to the Romans text, again, it's the same principle there. You have the sort of the Granville Sharp Rule. Either Christ is being called a God in the sense of a deified human being, or else he is not being called God at all, and you just have, something else going on there.
And people can check out, I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Murray Harris' work, Jesus as God, who is honest enough, I believe, to say that all these texts are ambiguous. They have issues. I think he actually uses the word problems, either, as he say, grammatically, textually, contextually. So that includes all the so-called Pauline Jesus our God text. Let me ask you one last one, and it's the Isaiah 9:6 passage. This is applied to the Messiah Jesus. Is called Mighty God there. What do you make of that one?
Yeah, I was just reading the NET Bible. I have this study edition with so many notes. It's like the notes take up more of the page than the actual biblical text. I was just reading this passage in the NET Bible this morning, and it makes the point that mighty God there is sort of a typically ancient way of referring to, a king, a governmental figure who is strong in battle and who sort of represents God to the people, the God of the people to them.
You're alluding to the NET, New English Translation Bible. They say some suggest that having read the New Testament, we might in retrospect interpret this title of El Gibor in the Hebrew, mighty God, as indicating the coming king's deity. In other words, that the coming king would be God. But it is unlikely that Isaiah or his audience would have understood the title in such a bold way. And then they note Psalm 45:6, from which Hebrews 1:8 quotes, addresses the Davidic king as God because he ruled and fought as God's representative on earth.
Yeah, exactly. Once again, it was not unusual or out of the ordinary in the ancient world for human beings to be called gods if they were particularly powerful or in a position of authority, if they stood between the real God, the divine being, and the people that served that God, and so on. So I think something like that is going on here. I would want to emphasize once more that these texts have a meaning that is native and original to them and that is appropriate for their time and context. And if there's anything that is obvious historically, is that there was no notion of, sort of no Nicene Chalcedonian notion of incarnation or Trinity in the time of Isaiah's writing. So to read the text in that way is, I think, inappropriate. This text has to mean something that would have been appropriate for Isaiah and for the people that he was talking to. And it seems to me that the way to take it that way is as follows. This person whose birth Isaiah is prophesying was a real human being who lived at some point in time, and he received these titles because, again, he was a king. He was a mighty person who represented the people and the people's God and the people's gods to them. So that's how I would talk about it. It's just another case of a human being being called God in a figurative sense, not in a sort of a substantial sense.